Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, where we transform how you communicate to create the life and relationships you truly want. I'm your host, Alejandra Siroka, and I help multicultural individuals, couples, and change makers move beyond surface level politeness and conflict avoidance to have authentic, value-based interactions that actually resolve issues and deepen connection. If you're tired of rehashing conversations in your head, walking on eggshells, or feeling misunderstood in your most important relationships, this podcast will give you a new way forward. And if you've been thinking about getting support with your communication, visit languagealchemy.com to find out which transformative communication program is most beneficial for you. I'm so glad you're here for this episode because today we are going to talk about one of the most costly habits in our relationships and also one of the most human things we do because we are going to talk about blame. Now, before you think, oh, Alejandra, I know all about blame, I like to invite you to stay curious because blame doesn't always show up the way we think it does. Sometimes blame looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes the person we blame most harshly isn't someone else. It's ourselves. And when we blame, we pay a very high price for it. So in this episode, we are going to explore why blame isn't useful, whether it is directed outward at others or inward at ourselves. We're also going to talk about why we engage in blame. And then, of course, I'm going to give you a language alchemy tool to transform blame into something far more meaningful. Let's start by describing what happens when a difficult conversation collapses into a blame conversation. And I want to give credit here where credit is due to the authors of the book Difficult Conversations, Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen, whose work has influenced my approach on understanding and transforming blame. When we have a hard time in a relationship and we resort to blame, what we are doing is asking 4 specific questions. First, who made this mistake? Second, who's the bad person here? Is it you? Is it me? Third, who gets to be righteously indignant? And fourth, who should apologize? Notice what all 4 questions have in common. They are looking for a verdict. None of these questions are helping us understand what happened. They are helping us decide who deserves to be punished. I had a student who attended a group coaching program, let's call her Miriam, who came to the program after a painful falling out with her closest friend of 15 years, someone she regarded as chosen family. The friendship had been slowly deteriorating for months, with misunderstandings piling up, plans being canceled, and conversations feeling more and more strained. Then the friend sent an email and the friendship just fell apart for good. When Miriam came to the group coaching program, she realized that she had spent weeks locked in an internal trial. She said, Alejandra, I have become the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the judge all at once. It was true. When she described what happened in the friendship, she would say things like, I should have seen the signs. My friend didn't care about me. It's all her fault. She never showed up for me. And then Miriam would correct herself and say, no, wait, I think it's all my fault. I was too needy. I should have never trusted her. Miriam went on this loop a few times, and the more she focused on the verdict, on who was to blame, the farther she would get from understanding what had actually happened between them. And this is what blame does. It looks backward. It is entirely focused on the past, on who caused this. And it has only one goal, and that is to assign punishment. So the outcome of blame is punishment, It is not learning, repairing, healing, or resolving. As the authors of Difficult Conversation wrote so clearly, when blame becomes the center of a conversation, learning what's really causing the problem becomes almost impossible. And without that understanding, we have no sustainable path forward. So if blame is so unhelpful, why do we keep doing it? Why does it feel so natural, like instinctive almost? And why does it even feel so satisfying in the moment? Well, here's what I've come to understand both from my own experience and also supporting hundreds of students and coaching clients. We tend to blame when we have big, uncomfortable feelings we do not know how to communicate. Feelings like hurt, fear, anger, profound disappointment over something we expected to happen that never happened, or it didn't happen the way we wanted it to happen, or maybe deep grief about something we lost. And here's the key. Most of us were not taught to communicate those feelings. Think back to when you were learning a language, those first 7 years of your life. Were you ever taught to say, I feel hurt when you don't call me back because I value our connection and I'm afraid it's fading? Probably not. Probably, like me, you were more likely to learn, you never call. That means you don't care about me. You only care about yourself. In the face of big feelings, we learned the language of blame. What happens when we have big feelings is that we experience vulnerability. When big feelings arise, they may seem too raw, and we may believe that we're too exposed to speak directly, too vulnerable. So what do? We reach for blame because it gives us the illusion that it will feel safer, and it puts the spotlight on the other person. It keeps us out of the vulnerable experience. When we communicate blame instead of vulnerability, we pay a really high cost. First, because blame reinforces the very problem it's trying to solve. When people feel blamed, they become defensive, less open, less honest, less willing to reflect on their own behavior, let alone to apologize. And they already know that punishment is waiting for them. So the truth of what actually happened becomes harder and harder to find. And this means that the challenge, the conflict, the problem will not be solved. We will have to carry the burden of it, and maybe we will have to learn to live with it. Many relationships become estranged because of blame and not knowing how to communicate with vulnerability. And secondly, the cost is high because we cannot have really close relationships or intimacy without vulnerability. So when we use the language of blame instead of the language of honest vulnerability, we can only afford to have superficial and dissatisfying relationships. I remember working with a couple, let's call them Jim and Elena, who were stuck in a painful loop after a major financial decision that didn't go well. Every conversation about money ended the same way. Accusations flying, voices rising, one person storming out. Jim blamed Elena for being reckless. Elena blamed Jim for being controlling. They were so focused on who was guilty, who was to blame, that they could not get what they both said they valued and they both wanted, which was to feel heard, to rebuild trust, and to make a different kind of plan together. Blame had become a wall between them and impacted every aspect of the relationship, so much so that they had been sleeping in different rooms for several months. And during the day, they kept their distance from one another. Now, let's address another aspect of blame, and that is when we direct it at ourselves. Many of us, especially those of us who tend to see ourselves as thoughtful, sensitive, self-aware people, can be extraordinarily skilled at blaming ourselves. Self-blame sounds like, I always do this. I ruin everything. What's wrong with me? I should have known better. I am the problem. What's so tricky about self-blame is that it can feel like self-awareness. It can even mask as humility or responsibility, but it's not the same thing. Self-blame, just like outward blame, is looking for a verdict. It asks, am I a bad person? And so it seeks punishment. And it usually finds it in the form of shame, self-criticism, or the paralysis that comes from feeling fundamentally flawed. I'm thinking of a client, let's call her Sophia, who came to me after ending a long-term relationship. She was drowning in self-blame. She said to me, I was too much. No, I wasn't enough. I destroyed the relationship. Sophia was so consumed with the verdict against herself that she felt completely stuck. In our work together, she recognized that she felt ashamed. And I helped her see that this self-blame habit didn't let her understand how she got there. That's because self-blame is like a death sentence. Whether blame is aimed outward or inward, it ends the inquiry. It gives a verdict and then slams the gavel down. And when that gavel falls, learning stops. So what can we do instead? Well, this is where language alchemy comes in. As you know, if you've been following me for some time, language alchemy begins with awareness. And the first step towards awareness here is to notice that we have slipped into blame language. To recognize the telltale questions of blame, listen for who is the bad person here? Who made the mistake? Who deserves punishment? Because once you see it, you can name it in a neutral way without judgment. You can say something like, oh, I'm in blaming mode right now. I'm looking for a verdict. This awareness gives you the opportunity to choose a different language. Not the language of judgment, but the language of acknowledgement that can lead us to curiosity, learning, understanding, compassion, transformation, and yes, skillful action. The authors of Difficult Conversations call this shift moving from blame to contribution. I love this concept because it completely reorients us. Contribution asks different questions. Instead of asking who's to blame, we ask, how did each of us contribute to bringing about this situation? And instead of asking, why did you do that? We ask, what do we each value here? And instead of, how should they be punished? We ask, what can we each do differently as we go forward? Can you see how these questions help us look at the whole system, at what each person brought to the dynamic, rather than reducing a complex human situation to a simple verdict? I hope you do. What I've seen over and over in my work is that when things go wrong in human relationships, everyone has contributed in some way. And it may not be an equal contribution, not like 50-50. It may not be symmetrical. But there are things we and the other person did or didn't do, or that we said or we didn't say that got us to where we are right now. When my clients Jim and Elena stopped insisting on who's guilty, and they started asking, how did we each get here? Jim could see that he had a deep fear of scarcity rooted in his experience of childhood. And so he kept track of every penny that came in or that was spent. He also realized he criticized Elena a lot for every spending choice. And he didn't give Elena any positive feedback about her choices. On the other hand, Elena could see that some of her spending was impulsive, and it was partly a way of asserting her autonomy in a relationship where she didn't feel she had shared power. These insights were not possible when blame was running the conversation. And speaking of conversation, I helped them see that Jim and Elena had never had a meaningful conversation about their values and their vision around money. So neither of them knew what the other or themselves wanted. When they shifted their conversation from pointing fingers and blaming each other to looking at their contribution, they were now in a great position to have a conversation about their values, about their vision, and how they could both collaborate with each other to get there. And now let's make this practical, because language alchemy is a practice. It's the conscious choice to use different words, ask different questions, and in doing so, open up different possibilities. When you notice blame arising in a conversation with someone else, here are the questions that can shift you from blame into contribution. Instead of asking, "Why did you do this to me?" ask, "What was happening for you when this occurred? Help me understand." Instead of saying, "This is your fault," ask, "What do you think we each brought to this situation?" And instead of saying, "You need to apologize," ask, "What would it take for each of us to feel repaired and ready to move forward?" And when you notice self-blame arising inside your internal dialogue, here are the questions that can shift you toward compassionate contribution. Instead of asking yourself, "Oh, what's wrong with me?" ask, "What was I needed in the moment that I didn't know how to ask for?" Instead of saying, "I always ruin things," ask, "What's one thing I can see more clearly now, and how can I use that going forward?" And instead of saying, "I am the problem," ask, "What did I contribute to this dynamic? And what is truly outside of my responsibility?" These are not small shifts. These questions require bravery. Contribution requires us to be honest about our own part in situations, in dynamics, in relationships. And that can feel uncomfortable. But this discomfort is the doorway to transformation. Before I leave, I want to come back to Sophia's story for a moment because it had such a beautiful transformation. After drowning herself in self-blame, Sophia began to practice asking herself questions about her contribution. And this is how she realized that she had spent years in that relationship making herself small, agreeing when she disagreed, staying quiet when she wanted to speak, going along with the plans that didn't feel right to her. She had contributed with a kind of emotional invisibility that over time communicated to her ex, "You matter more than I do." And that contributed to a dynamic in which she felt she didn't matter to her ex. That insight was liberating to her because it wasn't a verdict, it was information. And information, unlike shame, can actually lead us to transformation. Now, Sophia saw herself as a person who was learning, someone who could learn to make different choices in future intimate relationships and also in the relationship she was rebuilding with herself. And this is the third aspect of language alchemy as evolutionary activism, because when Sophia chose contribution language over blame language in her internal dialogue, she wasn't just helping herself. She was practicing a different way of being human, one that could eventually ripple out into every relationship she developed. And now let's recap what you've heard in this episode. Today we talked about blame and how blame looks backward and seeks a verdict. We also talked about how sometimes we blame ourselves. And when that happens, learning shuts down. Self-blame keeps us stuck. Finally, I gave you a communication tool to shift from blame into contribution by asking questions such as, how did we each get here? And what can we each do differently going forward? If this episode was helpful for you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you care about. And if you need help transforming blame into contribution and being able to develop and maintain healthy and meaningful relationships with yourself and others, then go to languagealchemy.com and reach out to me to find out how I can support you with communication coaching. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to the couples I'm working with right now. Shadan, Braden, Matt, Julia, Nilu, Tarek, thank you for the beautiful work you are doing to have healthy and meaningful relationships. Until next episode, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao! Original music by Gary LaPoe. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.